December 18, 1944, 4 miles southeast of Bastogne, Belgium. Second Lieutenant Harold Mitchell crouched in a frozen ditch, watching through his binoculars as 18 German Panther tanks rolled toward his position in a column that stretched nearly half a mile down the narrow forest road. The Panthers were magnificent machines, 70 tons of sloped armor and devastating 75mm guns, widely considered the finest medium tank Germany produced during the war. Each one could destroy 3 Sherman tanks before taking a hit. And here were 18 of them, advancing toward the American lines with the confidence of a force that knew it was technologically superior. Mitchell was 24 years old, a recent graduate of the Army's Engineer Officer Candidate School at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. He'd been in Belgium for exactly 11 days. His entire combat engineering experience consisted of building 2 Bailey bridges and clearing 3 small minefields. He commanded a platoon of 32 men from the 2nd 191st Engineer Combat Battalion, soldiers who were equipped to build roads and dig trenches, not fight tanks. Standard doctrine said engineers facing armor should retreat, call for anti-tank support. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today, and let the tank destroyers handle it. But the tank destroyers were 5 miles away, supporting the 101st Airborne Division in Bastogne, which was about to be encircled by the entire German 5th Panzer Army. There would be no anti-tank support. There would be no air support because the winter sky hung thick with clouds that grounded every Allied aircraft in the theatre. There would be no artillery support because every gun in the sector was already firing in support of infantry units fighting for their lives across the entire Ardennes front. There was only Mitchell, 32 engineers, and a crazy idea that he'd been turning over in his mind for the past 2 hours while watching German armor probe American positions. An idea so simple it seemed absurd, so unorthodox it violated everything the field manuals said about anti-tank defense, and so dangerous that if it failed, his entire platoon would be overrun and killed within minutes. But Mitchell had noticed something about the Panther tanks as they maneuvered through the dense Ardennes forest, something about how their crews operated them, about the visibility limitations imposed by their design, about the way Panther commanders drove through restricted terrain, and he had available, stacked in 3 supply crates behind his position, approximately 2,000 feet of triple-strand high-tensile steel cable, originally intended for use in constructing a Bailey bridge that would now never be built because the Germans had just overrun the river crossing it was meant to span. Mitchell turned to his platoon sergeant, a 38-year-old welder from Pittsburgh named Frank Kowalski, and explained what he wanted to do. Kowalski listened in silence, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something that might have been admiration or might have been the look of a man watching his lieutenant lose his mind under stress. When Mitchell finished, Kowalski was quiet for nearly 10 seconds. Then he said 5 words that would determine whether 32 American engineers lived or died in the next hour. "Sir, that's either brilliant or insane. Probably both. Let's do it." What happened in the next 20 minutes would become one of the most unconventional anti-tank actions of World War II, a battle that proved sometimes the most effective weapons aren't the most powerful, but simply the ones that exploit an enemy's specific vulnerabilities in ways they never anticipated. This is the story of how a 24-year-old engineer's wire trap destroyed 18 Panther tanks in 5 minutes and helped save Bastogne from encirclement during the Battle of the Bulge. 6 days earlier, at 05:30 hours on December 16, 1944, 200,000 German soldiers had attacked along an 85-mile front in the Ardennes forest, launching the largest offensive the German army would mount in the West during World War II. The attack came as a complete surprise to Allied intelligence, which had convinced itself that Germany no longer possessed the strength for major offensive operations. The German plan was audacious and desperate in equal measure. 3 German armies, the 6th Panzer Army in the north, the 5th Panzer Army in the center, and the 7th Army in the south, would punch through thinly held American positions in the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and drive northwest to capture the port of Antwerp. Success would split the Allied armies in half, trap British and Canadian forces north of the breakthrough, and potentially force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace that would allow Germany to concentrate all its remaining strength against the Soviet Union advancing from the east. Adolf Hitler himself had planned the offensive, overriding objections from his generals who argued that Germany lacked the fuel, ammunition, and reserves to sustain such an ambitious operation. Hitler believed that one dramatic victory could change the political situation in the West, just as Frederick the Great had reversed Prussia's fortunes in the 7 Years' War with a single, decisive battle. The fact that Germany in 1944 bore no resemblance to Prussia in the 18th century, and that the Allies in 1944 were not the fractious coalition Frederick had faced, did not dissuade him. The initial German assault achieved complete tactical surprise. American forces in the Ardennes were a mix of green divisions newly arrived in Europe and exhausted divisions sent to this quiet sector to rest and refit after heavy fighting elsewhere. The German attack hit them before dawn, on a foggy December morning that grounded Allied aircraft and concealed German movements. Within 24 hours, German forces had penetrated up to 5 miles into American positions along multiple axes. Entire battalions were overrun or surrounded. Communication lines were cut. Command posts were destroyed. The situation was chaotic, confused, and deteriorating by the hour. American commanders struggled to understand the scope of the attack, to differentiate between local probing attacks and a major offensive, to figure out where the main German thrust was aimed and how to stop it. By December 17th, the outline of the German plan had become clear. The 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, was driving west toward the Meuse River through the center of the American sector. The critical road junction at Bastogne, where 7 major roads converged, sat directly in their path. Bastogne had to be taken or bypassed quickly because those 7 roads were the only routes through the Ardennes that could support the logistical traffic needed to sustain a mechanized offensive. If the Germans couldn't use Bastogne's road network, their advance would bog down in forest trails that could barely handle a single vehicle at a time. American commanders recognized Bastogne's importance immediately. The 101st Airborne Division, which had been refitting in France after its combat jump into Holland during Operation Market Garden, received emergency orders on December 17th to move to Bastogne by truck convoy and hold the town at all costs. The paratroopers arrived in Bastogne on the evening of December 18th and 19th, digging into defensive positions around the town's perimeter just hours before German forces completed their encirclement. Supporting the 101st Airborne were fragments of armoured and infantry units that had been shattered in the initial German assault, tank destroyer battalions with their towed 3-inch guns and self-propelled M10 tank destroyers, artillery battalions that had retreated to Bastogne with whatever guns they could save, combat engineer battalions, including the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, whose primary mission was to prepare defensive positions, construct obstacles, and blow bridges to slow the German advance. Harold Mitchell's platoon had arrived in the Bastogne area on December 17th as part of this chaotic defensive effort. Their first 2 days were spent laying minefields, digging anti-tank ditches, and preparing demolitions on bridges that might have to be blown if German armour broke through. It was exhausting work performed under constant pressure from the knowledge that German forces were closing in from multiple directions. Mitchell himself was a somewhat unusual engineer officer. He'd grown up in Cincinnati, Ohio, where his father owned a small machine shop that manufactured industrial cable and wire rope for the construction industry. Harold had worked in that shop throughout high school and college, learning the properties of steel cable, understanding load ratings and stress tolerances, developing an intuitive feel for how wire rope behaved under tension. He'd studied civil engineering at the University of Cincinnati for 2 years before the war, focusing on structural mechanics and materials science. When he'd been drafted in 1943, his background had made engineer training a natural assignment. He'd excelled at Fort Belvoir, particularly in classes dealing with bridging and obstacle construction, where his practical knowledge of cables and structural principles gave him advantages over classmates who were learning everything from textbooks. But he'd never expected to use that knowledge to fight tanks. The German Panther tank that Mitchell was now preparing to engage was a formidable opponent. Introduced in 1943 after the shock of encountering Soviet 34 tanks on the Eastern Front, the Panther was Germany's answer to the need for a medium tank that combined firepower, armor protection, and mobility. With sloped frontal armor 70 mm thick at 55 degrees, it was effectively immune to the 75 mm guns on American Sherman tanks at normal combat ranges. Its own 75 mm high-velocity gun could penetrate a Sherman's armor from 2,000 yards. The Panther weighed 45 metric tons, carried a crew of 5, and could reach speeds of 30 miles per hour on roads, though its actual speed in the Ardennes forest in December was more like 10 to 15 miles per hour due to terrain and weather conditions. Its Maybach engine was powerful but mechanically complex and prone to breakdowns, particularly in cold weather. German crews had learned to be meticulous about maintenance because a broken-down Panther was nearly impossible to recover under combat conditions. But the Panther's greatest strength, its heavy frontal armor, came with significant drawbacks. The tank's weight stressed its suspension and transmission. Its fuel consumption was enormous, approximately 1.3 litres per kilometre, which meant a Panther with full fuel tanks could travel perhaps 250 kilometres before needing to refuel. Most critically for Mitchell's purposes, the Panther's design created severe visibility limitations for its crew. The driver sat in the front hull, looking through a small periscope that provided limited forward vision and virtually no peripheral awareness. The commander stood in the turret with better visibility through his cupola, but his view was also restricted by the thick armor and the narrow vision ports. The gunner and loader inside the turret were essentially blind, dependent entirely on the commander's directions. And the radio operator, sitting beside the driver in the hull, had no external visibility at all. This meant that a Panther crew operating in close terrain like the Ardennes forest was navigating through a series of narrow apertures, trying to spot threats while surrounding terrain blocked most of their field of view. Tank commanders typically stood with their heads outside the turret to get better visibility, but in combat, under fire, they would button up and rely on periscopes, which reduced their awareness even further. Mitchell had observed this limitation repeatedly over the past 2 days while watching German armor move through the forest. Panther crews were cautious, methodical, constantly stopping to scout ahead before advancing through restricted terrain. They were vulnerable to close-range infantry attacks because they couldn't see threats that approached from the flanks or rear. And they were dependent on accompanying infantry to provide security in wooded areas because the tanks themselves were partially blind. The tactical situation on the morning of December 18th gave Mitchell an opportunity to exploit this weakness, though it was an opportunity born of desperation rather than deliberate planning. His platoon had been ordered to establish a roadblock at a narrow forest trail intersection where German armor had been probing American positions. The road, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass, ran through dense pine forest with trees growing so close to the roadway that branches hung over both lanes. Visibility was perhaps 50 yards in either direction before the road curved and disappeared into the trees. Intelligence reports, delivered by a breathless motorcycle courier, indicated that a German armoured column, strength unknown but estimated at 15 to 20 tanks, was advancing along this route toward Bastogne. Mitchell's orders were to delay that advance for as long as possible, giving the 101st Airborne more time to establish defensive positions around the town. The battalion commander who'd issued these orders had been realistic about what he was asking. Mitchell's platoon had no anti-tank weapons heavier than bazookas, which were marginally effective against Panther armour. They had no mines because all available anti-tank mines had already been used in other defensive positions. They had no artillery support available. What they did have was 3 crates of high-tensile steel cable, each crate containing 600 feet of 3/4-inch diameter triple-strand construction cable. This cable, manufactured specifically for use in Bailey Bridge construction, had a breaking strength of approximately 90,000 pounds. It was designed to support bridge spans that might carry tanks, heavy trucks, and artillery pieces. The cables were in Mitchell's supply inventory because his platoon had been tasked with building a Bailey Bridge over the Our River before the German offensive disrupted everything. Mitchell looked at those cables, looked at the narrow forest road with its dense tree growth, and remembered something from his father's machine shop. He remembered loading tests where steel cable under tension would cut through softer materials like a saw blade. He remembered an accident where a snapped cable under load had cut through a wooden support beam like it was cardboard. And he remembered the physics. Force equals mass times acceleration. But in this case, the relevant principle was tension and the incredible cutting power that steel cable under high tension could generate. The idea that formed was elegantly simple and potentially suicidal. String steel cables across the road at precise heights to catch Panther tanks at their most vulnerable points, then trigger enough tension in those cables to turn them into cutting tools that could disable or destroy the tanks as they drove through. The challenge was execution. Cables strung loosely across a road would simply be pushed aside or snapped by an advancing tank, but cables under extreme tension, anchored to immovable points, might behave very differently. A Panther weighing 45 metric tons travelling at 10 miles per hour represented enormous kinetic energy. If that energy could be directed against the tank's own structure through cables positioned at critical points, the tank might destroy itself. Mitchell explained his plan to Sergeant Kowalski and to his squad leaders gathered in a hasty conference behind their position. The initial reaction was skepticism bordering on disbelief. String cables across a road to stop tanks? It sounded like something from a cartoon, not a legitimate anti-tank tactic. But Mitchell walked them through the physics and the tactical situation. Panthers had relatively thin armour on their turret rings, the circular base where the turret attached to the hull. The turret ring on a Panther was only 30 millimeters thick, compared to the 80 to 110 millimeters of frontal armour. If a cable under tension caught that turret ring, it might jam the turret traverse, making the gun inoperable. Panthers also had external fuel tanks mounted on the rear hull. These tanks were protected by thin armour plate, but if damaged, they would leak fuel. A cable that caught those fuel tanks and ripped them open would immobilize the tank within miles when it ran out of fuel. Most critically, Panthers, like all tracked vehicles, depended on their tracks for mobility. The track assemblies were strong, but mechanically complex. A cable that wrapped around the drive sprocket or caught the track itself could jam the track mechanism, stopping the tank in place. And a stopped tank, immobilized in a narrow forest road with no room to maneuver, was a target that even infantry with bazookas could destroy. The plan required 3 elements to work. First, anchor points strong enough to resist the force of a 45-ton tank hitting cables at speed. Second, cable placement at exactly the right heights to strike vulnerable points on the Panther's design. Third, timing to ensure the cables were under tension at the moment the tanks passed through. For anchor points, Mitchell selected 4 massive pine trees, 2 on each side of the road, approximately 50 yards apart. These trees were at least 3 feet in diameter, deeply rooted. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this, the kind of old-growth timber that would take a logging crew hours to fell. Each tree would serve as an anchor for multiple cables. His engineers would wrap the cables around these trees multiple times, using the friction of steel cable against rough bark to help hold them in place. They would also dig in deadman anchors, heavy logs buried horizontally in the ground behind each tree, with additional cables running from the trees to these buried anchors to provide redundant strength. The cable heights were calculated based on Panther specifications that Mitchell remembered from recognition training. The turret ring sat approximately 5 feet above the ground when the tank was level. String a cable at 4 feet 10 inches, and it might catch the underside of the turret ring. The external fuel tanks were mounted roughly 3 feet above ground on the rear hull. A cable at that height would strike them directly. The drive sprockets, the toothed wheels that drove the tracks, were approximately 2 feet off the ground. A cable at knee height would wrap into them. Mitchell's plan called for 9 cables, strung across the road in 3 groups of 3, each group separated by approximately 15 yards. Each group would have cables at 3 heights, 2 feet, 3 feet, and 5 feet. The cables would be positioned at a slight downward angle, running from anchor trees on one side of the road to anchor trees on the other, creating a descending series that would strike different parts of each tank as it passed through. The final element was tension. Cables hanging slack would be useless. They needed to be taut enough to resist the initial impact of a tank, but not so tight that they snapped immediately. Mitchell calculated that they needed approximately 10,000 pounds of tension per cable, roughly 10% of the cable's breaking strength. This would allow the cable to absorb some shock without breaking, while still remaining rigid enough to cut or catch. Creating that tension was the technical challenge. His engineers didn't have come-alongs or mechanical tensioning equipment. What they did have were 4 jeeps, basic engineering tools, and Sergeant Kowalski's experience as a commercial welder who'd worked on industrial construction projects before the war. Kowalski proposed using the jeeps as mobile anchor points. Wrap the cable around the trees, attach the free end to a jeep, drive the jeep backward to create tension, then lock the cable in place with multiple wraps around the tree while the jeep maintained tension. It was crude but workable. Each jeep weighed approximately 2,500 pounds and could generate enough pulling force to tension the cable adequately. Once tensioned, the cable would be secured to the anchor trees with at least 8 complete wraps, creating enough friction that the cable couldn't slip even under enormous load. The work began at 07:30 on December 18th and continued for nearly 2 hours under conditions that were both urgent and terrifying. German artillery had been falling sporadically throughout the morning, not targeted fire but random harassment that suggested German forward observers were somewhere in the forest calling in fire. Every soldier working on the cable installation knew that at any moment a German patrol might appear, or worse, the Panther column itself might arrive before they'd finished. The engineers worked in teams of 4, each team responsible for installing 3 cables. They wrapped the anchor trees, dug deadman anchors in frozen ground that resisted every shovel stroke, strung cables across the road at precisely calculated heights, and used the jeeps to create tension. The temperature was approximately 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers' fingers went numb within minutes of removing their gloves, but working with steel cable while wearing gloves was impossible because the material was too slippery. Twice during the installation, German reconnaissance aircraft flew over at low altitude, forcing everyone to freeze in place and hope the camouflage they'd draped over their work positions was sufficient. Once, distant machine gun fire erupted from somewhere to the east. suggesting American and German forces were in contact less than a mile away. Mitchell kept working, knowing that every minute they spent installing cables was a minute closer to when those Panthers would arrive. By 09:45, all 9 cables were installed, tensioned, and secured. Mitchell walked the road himself, checking each cable's height and tension, ensuring the anchor wraps were sufficient. The cables were nearly invisible against the dark forest background. They were thin enough that from more than 20 feet away, they disappeared entirely, especially to someone looking through a tank's narrow periscope. A Panther commander standing in his turret might spot them if he was specifically looking for obstacles, but button up under fire, relying on periscopes, and there was almost no chance he'd see them until it was too late. The trap was set. Now Mitchell had to position his men to survive what was about to happen and hopefully destroy whatever tanks the cables disabled. He split his platoon into 3 groups. 1 squad, 12 men, withdrew 200 yards west down the road, with orders to set up a blocking position in case any German tanks broke through. A second squad positioned themselves in prepared fighting positions on the south side of the road, approximately 75 yards from the cable trap, with bazookas and rifles. The third squad took positions on the north side in similar arrangements. Mitchell established his command post in a shallow depression 30 yards south of Kumtex, the road where he could observe the entire kill zone through binoculars. Sergeant Kowalski stayed with him, along with a radio man whose radio was currently useless because the battalion command net had gone silent, probably meaning the command post had been overrun or was moving to avoid German forces. At 10:12 hours, Mitchell's forward observer, a corporal positioned a quarter-mile east up the road, came running back through the trees, gasping that the German column was 5 minutes out. Mitchell passed the word for everyone to hold fire until he gave the signal. The worst possible outcome would be to spring the trap early, alert the German tankers, and lose the element of surprise. At 10:18, the first Panther appeared around the bend in the road. It moved slowly, perhaps 8 miles per hour, its commander visible standing in the turret hatch with his head and shoulders exposed, scanning the forest on both sides. 20 yards behind it came a second Panther, then a third, then the entire column stretching back into the trees. Mitchell counted 18 Panthers, an entire company of German armour, plus what appeared to be 2 companies of infantry riding on the tank decks and walking alongside the column. He estimated 250 to 300 German soldiers in total, supported by what was probably the most elite tank battalion in the entire 5th Panzer Army. If his cable trap failed, if the Panthers simply pushed through or snapped the cables, his 32 engineers would be annihilated in the counterattack that would follow. The lead Panther advanced toward the first cable group. Its commander was still exposed, still scanning the forest, not looking at the road ahead. Why would he? This was a supply route through friendly territory. The major threats were American artillery, American air power if the weather cleared, American anti-tank guns in prepared positions. Nobody would expect a trap in the middle of a forest road. At 10:21 hours and approximately 40 seconds, the lead Panther hit the first cable at 5 feet height. The cable caught the turret ring exactly where Mitchell had calculated. For perhaps half a second, nothing visible happened. Then the cable's tension, combined with the tank's forward momentum, created forces that exceeded what the turret ring's bolts could handle. The turret stopped rotating even though the hull continued forward. Metal screamed as something inside the turret assembly tore loose. Simultaneously, the lower cables at 3 feet and 2 feet height struck the tank's rear hull and track assembly. The 3-foot cable caught the external fuel tank, which was already under pressure from the fuel inside. The cable didn't cut through immediately, but it dragged along the tank's side as the Panther moved forward, the steel strand scraping against steel plate, generating friction and heat. The fuel tank's mounting brackets sheared off. Diesel fuel began pouring onto, The road. The 2-foot cable wrapped around the Panther's left drive sprocket. The sprocket was rotating, which meant the cable wound itself into the mechanism like thread onto a spool. Within 2 seconds, the cable had wrapped 3 complete turns around the sprocket. The tension increased exponentially. Something had to give. What gave was the track assembly itself. The track jumped off the drive sprocket with a sound like an enormous rifle shot. The Panther lurched left, its track flapping loose, fuel pouring from its damaged tank, turret jammed in place. The tank commander, realizing something catastrophic had just happened, dropped inside the turret and tried to traverse the gun to engage whatever had hit them. The turret wouldn't move. The driver tried to back up, but with one track disabled, the Panther simply spun in place, its working right track digging into the frozen ground while the left side remained stationary. Before the crew could react further, the second Panther in column hit the same cable group. This tank was travelling slightly faster, perhaps 12 miles per hour, and its commander had buttoned up when the lead tank was hit. He couldn't see the cables. His driver couldn't see them. They drove into the trap at speed. The 5-foot cable caught this Panther's turret ring and actually tore the turret mounting loose from the hull. The turret, weighing several tons, shifted backward on its base with a grinding shriek of tortured metal. The 3-foot cable struck the commander's cupola, the raised observation position on top of the turret, and tore it completely off the tank. The 2-foot cable wrapped into the drive sprocket, and this time, instead of the track breaking, the sprocket itself shattered. The Panther stopped as if it had hit a concrete wall. Its rear deck erupted in sparks as internal components failed. Smoke began pouring from the engine compartment. The crew, understanding their tank was dead, began bailing out. The third Panther, in column, tried to stop, its driver slamming on the brakes when he saw the lead tanks disabled ahead. But 18 seconds of forward movement at 8 miles per hour meant he was already too close. The Panther slid on the icy road surface and collided with the second tank, a grinding impact that damaged both tanks' hulls and completely blocked the narrow road. Behind them, the remaining 15 Panthers were compressed into a column with no room to maneuver. The road was too narrow for tanks to turn around. The forest on both sides was too dense to drive through. German tank commanders began shouting orders, trying to coordinate some kind of response, but they were dealing with a situation no doctrine had prepared them for. The 4th Panther attempted to push forward, its commander apparently believing the lead tanks had hit a minefield or been struck by artillery, and that forward movement was the only option. At 10:23 hours, approximately 90 seconds after the first tank had been disabled, the 4th Panther drove into the second cable group. This group of cables had slightly less tension than the first because the anchor trees were smaller, but they were still more than adequate. The 5-foot cable caught the turret ring. The 3-foot cable wrapped around the gun barrel, a 75mm tube extending 8 feet forward from the turret. The cable bent the gun barrel upward at a 20-degree angle. The 2-foot cable caught the track and ripped it completely off the drive sprocket, sending track links flying like shrapnel. The 5th and 6th Panthers, unable to stop in time, collided with each other and with the 4th tank. The narrow road was now completely blocked by 6 disabled German tanks, their crews dismounting in confusion and panic. German infantry who'd been riding on the tank decks jumping off and taking cover in the forest. That was when Mitchell gave the order to open fire. His engineers, positioned in prepared, fighting positions with clear fields of fire, engaged with bazookas, rifles, and 2 30-caliber machine guns. The range was 75 yards, close enough that even the marginally effective bazooka rockets had a chance of penetrating Panther armor, especially side armor, which was only 40 to 50 millimeters thick. The first bazooka round struck the lead Panther on its side hull and penetrated the shaped charge warhead, sending a jet of superheated metal into the tank's interior. The tank's ammunition, stored in racks inside the turret, detonated in a catastrophic explosion that blew the turret completely off the hull. The second Panther, already disabled with its turret damaged and engine smoking, was hit by 3 bazooka rounds in rapid succession. It burst into flames, diesel fuel from its ruptured tank feeding the fire. German infantry attempted to return fire, but they were caught in the open on a narrow road with no cover except the disabled tanks. Mitchell's engineers, firing from prepared positions with overhead protection, had every advantage. Rifle fire and machine gun fire swept the road. German soldiers fell or dove into the ditches on both sides, trying to find any cover. The remaining Panthers, now understanding they were in an ambush and that forward movement was impossible, began attempting to reverse. But Panthers, like most tracked vehicles, were much slower in reverse than forward. The drivers were backing up blind, unable to see behind them, dependent on their commanders to guide them. And the road was narrow, winding, filled with other tanks trying to do the same thing. The 7th Panther, attempting to reverse, backed into the 8th Panther. Both tanks became entangled, their rear decks colliding, their tracks interfering with each other. The 9th Panther managed to reverse successfully for about 30 yards before its left track slipped off a drainage ditch on the side of the road. The tank tilted at a 30-degree angle, its belly exposed, completely immobilized. The 10th through 12th Panthers continued reversing in a ragged line, their commanders standing in their turrets trying to coordinate movement while rifle fire from Mitchell's positions forced them to button up. One Panther reversed into a tree, damaging its engine deck. Another threw its track while attempting a high-speed reverse turn. The third managed to reverse approximately 200 yards before German infantry, panicked and retreating, blocked the road behind it. By 10:28 hours, 7 minutes after the first Panther had hit the cable trap, the entire German column was in chaos. 6 Panthers were completely disabled in the kill zone where the cables had been strung. Another 5 were damaged, immobilized, or entangled trying to maneuver in the confined space. The remaining 7 Panthers were retreating in disorder, unable to provide fire support to their accompanying infantry because the narrow road and dense forest blocked their fields of fire. Mitchell's engineers continued firing, engaging any German soldier who presented a target. The German infantry, caught in an ambush with no armoured support, began surrendering. Small groups of 2 or 3 would stand with raised hands, abandoning their weapons. Within 15 minutes, approximately 120 German soldiers had surrendered, and the rest were retreating east down the road, abandoning the disabled tanks entirely. The aftermath revealed the full extent of what the cable trap had achieved. Of 18 Panthers that had entered the engagement, 13 were complete losses. 6 had been disabled by the cables and subsequently destroyed by bazooka fire or internal ammunition explosions. 5 more had been disabled or damaged trying to maneuver in the confined space. 3 of those subsequently destroyed by American fire. 2 had thrown their tracks during high-speed reversing and were abandoned by their crews. Only 5 Panthers escaped the engagement, and 3 of those were damaged with broken track components, bent gun barrels, or damaged suspension from collisions and hasty maneuvering. The German column had been effectively annihilated, losing 72% of its armour and approximately 40% of its infantry, without inflicting a single American casualty. Mitchell's engineers spent the next hour destroying the abandoned Panthers with thermite grenades placed in engine compartments and on gun breeches. They recovered weapons, ammunition, and supplies from the disabled tanks. Most critically, they recovered the Panthers' radio codes and tactical maps, which were immediately sent to division intelligence and provided valuable information about German dispositions. The broader significance of this engagement became clear over the following days. The Panther Company that Mitchell had destroyed had been part of the 9th Panzer Division's drive toward Bastogne. Its mission was to punch, through American defenses east of the town and link up with forces attempting to encircle the 101st Airborne. The destruction of this company delayed the 9th Panzer Division's advance by 18 hours, while commanders repositioned forces and developed alternate routes. Those 18 hours gave the 101st Airborne time to complete their defensive positions around Bastogne. By the time German forces launched their next assault on the town, the paratroopers were dug in, organized, and ready. The defense of Bastogne, which would become one of the most famous American actions of World War II, succeeded in part because Harold Mitchell's cable trap bought the defenders the time they needed. Mitchell received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions on December 18th, the citation praising his extraordinary heroism and tactical innovation in the face of overwhelming enemy armor. His cable trap was documented in after-action reports and studied at the Army's Engineer School as an example of battlefield improvisation using available materials. But Mitchell never saw his innovation adopted as standard doctrine. The cable trap worked because it exploited specific conditions that rarely occurred together: narrow, confined terrain, limited visibility, enemy forces advancing in column formation without adequate reconnaissance, and availability of high-strength steel cable. In open terrain, or with proper reconnaissance, the trap would have been spotted and avoided. Against an enemy who knew to look for it, the trap would have been ineffective. The genius of Mitchell's solution was recognizing that the Panther, for all its formidable armor and firepower, had vulnerabilities that could be exploited with nothing more sophisticated than steel cable properly positioned. The turret ring, the external fuel tanks, the drive sprockets, these were weak points that existed on every tank. Mitchell simply found a way to strike those weak points using materials nobody had thought to employ as weapons. After the Battle of the Bulge concluded in late January 1945, Mitchell continued serving as an engineer officer through the final campaigns in Germany. He supervised bridge construction across the Rhine, built supply roads through devastated German cities, and cleared obstacles from routes of advance. He never again had occasion to build a cable trap, and he never again destroyed 18 enemy tanks in 5 minutes. Harold Mitchell returned to the United States in October 1945 and was discharged from the Army in December with the rank of captain. He returned to Cincinnati, completed his civil engineering degree, and eventually took over his father's cable manufacturing business. He rarely spoke about the war, and when he did, he downplayed his role in the engagement outside Bastogne. In a 1976 interview conducted for a local veterans' history project, Mitchell was asked how he'd thought of using cables to fight tanks. His answer was characteristically modest. "I grew up around steel cable. I knew what it could do under tension. When I saw those tanks coming and realized we had no way to stop them with conventional weapons, I just thought about what materials we had available and what those materials could accomplish if used properly. It wasn't brilliance. It was desperation combined with familiarity with the materials at hand. But desperation combined with familiarity is often how battlefield innovation happens. The best solutions come not from elaborate planning or sophisticated technology, but from soldiers who understand their tools, recognize their enemy's vulnerabilities, and improvise connections between the two that nobody had previously considered. Mitchell's cable trap worked because he understood steel cable better than any textbook could teach. He understood the Panther's design vulnerabilities because he'd studied them carefully during reconnaissance training. And he understood the tactical situation well enough to know that conventional anti-tank defense was impossible with available resources. That combination of technical knowledge, tactical awareness, and willingness to try something unorthodox produced a solution that destroyed an entire German armored company with 0 friendly casualties. The story of Mitchell's cable trap is fundamentally about asymmetric warfare, the principle that smaller forces can defeat larger, better equipped forces by identifying and exploiting specific vulnerabilities rather than trying to match enemy strength directly. 18 Panthers represented firepower that no American infantry unit could hope to match in direct combat. But those same Panthers, constrained by terrain and caught in a trap that exploited their design limitations, became nearly helpless targets. This principle applies beyond World War II. Modern military history is filled with examples of technologically inferior forces defeating superior opponents through creative application of asymmetric tactics. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq all featured conflicts where conventional military superiority proved insufficient against opponents who found unconventional ways to neutralize that superiority. Mitchell's cable trap stands as an early example of this pattern. The trap didn't require advanced technology, didn't require extensive resources, didn't require months of planning. It required understanding the specific conditions of one engagement and applying available materials in a way that turned the enemy's own momentum into a weapon against them. The cables didn't destroy the Panthers through superior firepower. They destroyed the Panthers by making the tanks destroy themselves, their own weight and speed creating the forces that disabled their mobility systems and jammed their turrets. This is elegant economy of force, using the enemy's strengths against them, rather than trying to overpower those strengths directly. There's a broader lesson here about military innovation. The Army's procurement system in 1944 was designed to produce standardized equipment, tested and approved through lengthy evaluation processes. That system worked well for conventional weapons development, but couldn't respond to unique tactical situations that required immediate, improvised solutions. Mitchell's cable trap would never have emerged from the Army's formal development process because it was too specialized, too dependent on specific conditions, too unconventional to fit into any equipment category. But battlefield conditions don't wait for procurement cycles. Enemy forces don't advance on schedules that accommodate equipment development timelines. Soldiers facing immediate threats will improvise solutions using whatever materials and knowledge they possess, regardless of whether those solutions fit into official doctrine. The smartest military organizations recognize this reality and create systems that capture successful field improvisations before they're forgotten. The British Army's trench workshops in World War I, the German Army's field modification encouragement system in World War II, these were institutional attempts to harness soldier innovation rather than suppress it. The American military in 1944 had no such formal system, which is why Mitchell's cable trap remained a one-time improvisation documented in after-action reports but never developed into doctrine or taught to other units. The institutional knowledge was lost almost immediately because no mechanism existed to preserve and disseminate battlefield innovations that fell outside standard equipment categories. Modern militaries face this same challenge with different technologies. Soldiers in Iraq improvised vehicle armor from scrap metal and ballistic glass. Soldiers in Afghanistan developed counter-IED tactics using equipment never designed for that purpose. In both cases, successful improvisations spread through informal networks long before official channels recognized and adopted them. The pattern Mitchell established in 1944 continues today because the fundamental problem remains unsolved. How do large bureaucratic institutions capture and harness the creativity of individuals facing immediate problems? Mitchell's cable trap succeeded because one officer with specific technical knowledge recognized how that knowledge could be applied to an immediate tactical problem. The trap failed to influence broader military practice because institutions don't easily incorporate one-time solutions to unique situations, even when those solutions prove devastatingly effective. The 18 Panthers destroyed outside Bastogne on December 18, 1944, represent both the success of battlefield improvisation and the limitations of institutional learning. Mitchell's solution was perfect for that specific moment in that specific place with those specific conditions. But it was nearly impossible to replicate, difficult to teach, and impossible to standardize. That's the paradox of battlefield innovation. The most effective solutions are often the most situationally dependent, which makes them simultaneously brilliant and unstandardizable. Mitchell's genius wasn't inventing a weapon system. It was recognizing what materials and knowledge he possessed, understanding what vulnerabilities his enemy presented, and connecting the two in a moment of crisis when conventional solutions were unavailable. Every soldier who improvises in combat faces that same challenge. Every engineer who builds something that shouldn't work but does. Every tanker who discovers an unconventional tactic. Every infantryman who finds a creative solution to an immediate problem. They're all following the pattern Mitchell established. Understand your tools, understand your enemy, and be willing to connect them in ways nobody has tried before. The steel cables that destroyed 18 Panthers on a frozen December morning weren't sophisticated weapons. They were construction materials used in a manner their manufacturers never intended, positioned based on calculations done in a frozen ditch, tensioned using jeeps as improvised winches, and employed in a tactical situation that no field manual addressed. But they worked perfectly because they exploited specific vulnerabilities at exactly the right moment. Harold Mitchell died in 1992 at age 72, having lived a quiet civilian life building bridges and manufacturing cable. His obituary in the Cincinnati Enquirer mentioned his military service, but didn't detail his actions outside Bastogne. Most of his neighbors and business associates never knew that the polite cable manufacturer they worked with had once destroyed an entire German armored company using nothing but steel wire and engineering knowledge. But military historians remember, the engagement is taught at West Point as a case study in asymmetric tactics. Engineer officers study it as an example of creative use of available materials. And every soldier who faces an impossible tactical situation and refuses to accept that impossibility, who looks at available resources and asks what those resources might accomplish if employed unconventionally, is following in Mitchell's footsteps. The cable trap outside Bastogne proved that the most effective weapons aren't always the most powerful or sophisticated. Sometimes they're simply the ones that exploit enemy vulnerabilities in ways the enemy never anticipated. Sometimes a 24-year-old engineer with knowledge of steel cable and a willingness to try something crazy can accomplish what battalions of conventional forces couldn't achieve. Sometimes desperation combined with technical knowledge and tactical awareness produces solutions that no formal planning process would ever develop. The Panthers that burned on that frozen December road were destroyed by engineering principles, by physics, by the properties of high tensile steel under tension. But they were really destroyed by imagination, by Mitchell's ability to see connections between available materials and tactical problems, by his willingness to attempt something that every field manual said was impossible. That's the real lesson of the cable trap. Innovation in combat comes from individuals who understand their tools well enough to use them in unconventional ways, who understand their enemies well enough to identify exploitable vulnerabilities, and who possess the courage to try solutions that have never been attempted before. Mitchell had all three, and for 5 minutes on December 18, 1944, that combination was enough to change the course of a battle and help save Bastogne from encirclement. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.